We are now going to shift gears a bit to the VA funding system, which is a resource some people think of a lot and some people don't think of enough. And to speak to us about that today is Dr. Schofield. He is the Associate Chief of Staff for Research at the Oklahoma City VA, isn't it? Yeah. Oklahoma City VA, and Professor of Medicine at the University of Oklahoma. And he's going to speak to us about the VA merit review and other grant processes.
We're only going to change gears a little bit because almost everything we've heard in the last two speakers applies directly and completely to VA merit reviews. I'll just remind you a little bit about, I'll just say, and I'll emphasize one of those things, maybe two of those things before I fully get started. I'm qualified to do this talk because I've been funded at the VA for a long time and the NIH even longer, and I'm the Associate Chief of Staff for Research at our VA. If you are working at a medical center that has an affiliated VA, there is an Associate Chief of Staff for Research at your VA. More importantly, there's an Administrative Officer for Research in VO lingo, that's the AO, and he or she will be, the Associate Chief of Staff for Research will be very helpful, but that Administrative Officer will be really helpful in terms of the nuts and bolts of what to do and how to put in a grant. But I'll just remind you how these, just to emphasize what has come before me in this session, I'll remind you how these committees work. That there might be 20 people on a review committee, and the VA committees, as I'll say later, are constructed almost identically to NIH committees. There is a parallel committee, VA committee. They are separate, but they are almost identical in their makeup and what kind of grants they review to the NIH. There might be 20 people in these committees, and you can find not only the standing members, but you can find the full roster of the previous committee, the last committee that met on the NIH or the VA website, and find out all the ad hoc members and see who's on those committees. But only 3 people will be assigned your grant out of 20. You can be guaranteed that at least 2 of those 3 people are not some kind of expert in your field. At best, 1 of those people is an expert in your field. So you cannot write a grant that is for the 10 people most interested in your idea and your project in the whole world. That's not who's going to review your grant. And nothing is more aggravating when you're reviewing grants, which I've done, as the previous speakers all have done also, a bunch of abbreviations you don't understand. That might be really very common in your field when you're talking to the 10 guys that are most interested in your field at a poster session, but I don't have any idea what those abbreviations mean because I'm not really an expert in your field. I might be an expert in immunology, and that's why I got assigned to your grant, because I am an immunologist. But I won't understand your abbreviations and having to go back and figure out what you were talking about. So you can't write a grant. Grants really have to be more like a Scientific American article that any sophisticated person could understand, not the people most interested in your field. One thing we haven't talked about, again, only 3 of the people, when that committee gets together at 8 o'clock in the morning in Bethesda, or over the phone maybe, on a Zoom conference, only 3 out of 20 people will have read your grant. And while those people are talking, the other members of the committee might open your grant to 2 places. The specific aim page, so that's a critically important part of your grant. I'd like your advice very nicely. You have to write the specific aim section first. I worked for many years with someone who never did that. And it was impossible to work with her because she never knew what her specific aims were. She's trying to ride along, and you have to know what your aims are going to be. And the other place the other reviewers might open to, which sometimes is a really ignored piece of the grant by investigators, is the abstract. And so if you have to write a really great abstract that tells those other 17 reviewers what you're doing and why it's important. And if you don't, well then and the range of the scores, they always say at the end, okay, here's the range of the scores, it's 3 to 6. If they read your abstract and didn't really get it, they'll give you a 6. But if they read your abstract and it was clear to them, reading a 40-line abstract, what you're going to do and why it's important, they'll give you a 3 out of when the range is 3 to 6, and you'll get your money. And so all this, there's just these critical areas you have to pay attention to. Like I said, I'll just remind you about VA healthcare. There's 20 million veterans in the United States. 2 million of them are women. 9 million people in the United States are enrolled in VA healthcare. And the last year I could find good data for, fiscal year 18-19, 6.3 million veterans got care in the VA. So there's 3 million people that are enrolled but didn't actually get care. That makes the VA the biggest provider of medical care in the country. And almost 5 million people have disability compensation from the VA, and so they need to come to the VA. 90,000 of those have are amputees. The VA has a system-wide EMR. So if you're a veteran and you go to the VA in Bonham, Texas, there's a VA in Bonham, Texas because Sam Rayburn was a Speaker of the House for 25 years. Not everybody remembers Senator Sam, but I do. I grew up in Texas. But if you go to the Bonham VA, they can open your medical record and find out what happened at the Hines VA in Los Angeles last month. So that brings up a bunch of interesting research opportunities too, since you have the whole system captured. All the bad publicity about the VA over the last few years is about access to care. Once you get into the system, there's abundant data. The last really nice paper I know about was in the JAMA Internal Medicine spring a year ago, compared inpatient, what Medicare looks at for quality of care, the 12 items Medicare looks at for quality of care, looked at all 126 VA hospitals compared to 5,000 private hospitals or non-VA hospitals. The VA was better in all 12 measures of quality of care. So all those problems about the VA recently have been, are mostly about access to care. The VA didn't have enough people hired to do the jobs. VA Research and Development was founded 90 years ago, so that makes it about 20 years older than NIH. There's 3 Nobel laureates who did their work at the VA, including Rosalind Yalow at the Bronx VA, who invented the radioimmunoassay. That's the only one of those I know that I've personally met. And there's 7 Lasker Awards. The developments of the VA are really quite remarkable over the years. The reason we all know that it's good to treat hypertension is VA cooperative studies that showed treatment of hypertension lowered stroke. The implantable cardiac pacemaker was developed at the VA. Kidney transplantation was developed at the VA. At my VA, Ben Sherlag and Ralph Lazara in cardiology figured out how reentrant tachycardias worked, and that led directly to radio frequency ablation of those arrhythmias. So all that kind of thing has been done at the VA. I just got this straight off the VA's website. This is the VA website. This is the VA mission statement of VA research. But we don't have to read all those. I'm not much of a mission statement person, but I like this one. And the VA is serious about this, about attracting, training, and retaining the highest caliber investigators and nurturing their careers. And so as I said, locally, the Associate Chief of Staff for Research is charged with this, and nationally, they're serious about this idea. And we'll talk about some of that. As I said, there's 126 VA health systems across the country. They're divided into veteran service networks. There's about 20 of those. Almost all of these have some research, but really there's only about 80 or 90 with substantial research programs. Almost all of those are affiliated with the university, and they used to be called Dean's Committees, VA. That was a phrase that Michael DeBakey developed at the Houston VA in relationship with Baylor College of Medicine, the Houston VA. They now have another name, but Dean's Committee is kind of their traditional name. All of them are going to have a research and development committee, and as I said, are going to have a associate chief of staff for research, and all of them are going to have duly appointed faculty. Faculty members that are appointed at the VA, but are also faculty members at their affiliated universities. Almost everyone will have a dual appointment, and I'll get into how that might work for you. There's 4 VA research services, biomedical research laboratories, mostly for preclinical studies. Could be animals, could be physiology, cell biology on cultured cells. The clinical science research is translational studies on humans. Really, probably in those clinical science studies, the outcome of your research, the study unit of your research is probably human beings. Although really, if you're going to do anything but draw blood on humans, you're probably out of, if you're going to draw blood on humans and study cells, maybe you're going to do a skin biopsy, you could still be in biomedical. If you're going to do anything else in humans, you're probably going to be in clinical science. Like, for instance, we have a non-clinician PhD at my institution who does muscle biopsies, so he's in clinical science. There's health services research, which of course is about patient care and cost and quality services, and the VA has gotten into this very big, especially at some VA medical centers. And there's a rehabilitation service. As I said, there's 90,000 amputees. There's lots of reason for the VA needs to be expertise in in rehab, including traumatic brain injury, which has been in the news here recently. And the Rehabilitation Research Service really funds the full range of rehabilitation, research about rehabilitation, all the way preclinical animal studies, all the way to human studies. And here's how all that's arranged at the VA. The four research services under a Chief Research and Development Officer, the CRADO. There's also lots of VA abbreviations. I was giving abbreviations a hard time a minute ago. There's a CRADA and a CRADO. A CRADO is a single person who's running the VA research services, and they directly report to the Deputy Undersecretary of Health and Veterans Services. There's also, I just mentioned there, under clinical studies, there's VA cooperative studies. And so these are large multi-center studies. They're clinical trials or epidemiology. And there's very nice resources across the VA for these kind of very large trials. As I said, the ones that come to mind over the years were the original trials that showed that treatment of hypertension prevented strokes. That was the VA cooperative trials. There's always 10 or 12 of these trials active. There's 5 data and statistical coordinating centers out there at the VA to support these trials. There's a research pharmacy coordinating center that will work with your pharmacy to get these trials underway. 4 epidemiological centers, and then these trials always support local study coordinators and nurses. And I don't know if anyone's done clinical trials in the past, but almost all, if you get a clinical trial from the pharmaceutical industry, they pay you per patient almost always. And so then you have to recruit enough patients to pay for your nurses or study coordinators. These VA cooperative studies almost always pay for 1 full-time equivalent nurse or half a full-time equivalent nurse, and then that's it. They don't pay you per patient. So they're very actually work out really well financially, and maybe it pays for a full-time equivalent. You don't quite need a full-time equivalent, so that person can do something else for you at the same time. And so, for instance, right now I have very active GI doctors in my hospital, and so they have 2 cooperative trials going. One of them is about how to screen for colon cancer, screening people multiple ways for colon cancer, and they're the biggest recruiters in the country for that trial. So there's lots of these interesting cooperative trials that are VA specific. There are some focus and emphasis areas. These are not focus and emphasis areas for VA research. This is the entire VA system, and some of them are pretty obvious. Suicide prevention is in there, women's health, Gulf War industry, illness, post-traumatic stress disorder is a specific emphasis area, and as well as traumatic brain injury. And people with traumatic brain injury are at high risk for PTSD, and so those go together. And then in general, it's kind of general clinical areas about long-term care, opioids, and virtual care, telemedicine. All that is emphasis of the system, and it has to be emphasis of research. And those are reflected sometimes in the request for proposals that are out there, RFAs and RFPs that are out there about specific problems. There's one right now for traumatic brain injury, and so you can respond to those. Well, and the grant really the equivalent of the R01 at the VA is the Merit Review Grant. It's investigator initiated, hypothesis driven. Everything we heard about R01s applies to merit reviews. All the research services have a parent funding opportunity for the Merit Review Grant. The budgets vary with service a little bit, but generally they're for 4 years, which is a little bit different than R01s because you can get 5 years on your R01. The maximum length of time on the merit reviews is 4 years. Who can put in a VA merit review? Well, all clinicians who are appointed at the VA can put in a merit review. Non-clinician PhDs can also put in a merit review, and I'll tell you how that process works. And there's also career development awardees. If you're awarded a career development award from the VA, then at the end of that career development award, you're automatically eligible to put in a VA merit review. You must be a 5/8 VA employee at the day the grant starts. You do not have to be a 5/8 VA employee when you put the grant in. That used to not be the case for clinicians. You had to be a 5/8 VA employee at the day you put the grant in. But now your director can say in the director's letter, which is part of these grants, that he will appoint you 5/8 when you become a VA employee. And so probably most people don't quite understand what that might mean, and so I'll try to tell you what that might mean. 5/8 is 25 hours a week. And your allotment of time is a negotiation between you and your chairman, the chief of your service at the VA, and your associate chief of staff for research. I think a lot of clinicians think that means they're going to have to be in the clinic or on the wards for 25 hours, and that is not correct. We would routinely, across the country, I think almost everyone would do this, 3/8 of your time would be allotted to your grant. Or if you were already 5/8 appointed and you're going to put a VA grant in the next couple of years, we'd say 3/8 of your time is getting that grant ready to be put in. And so, and then maybe only 1/8 of your time is clinical. So that might be going to half a day clinic a week. And so you go to one clinic a week. And then 1/8 of your time might be administrative or educational, so you get time to educate yourself. So you go to CME on your campus, you get to count that as VA time. I might give you a job and you're on my safety committee. There's a VA, or you're on the R&D committee, you're on the research safety committee. And so then you can use some of your time for that. And so it means clinicians you're not on the wards the whole time. And then, and what about your time at your university? You might go to your university, and you could go to departments at my university, and they'll say, oh, you're 5/8 VA employee, that's 25 hours. Let's see, that gives you 15 hours to work at the university. That's not correct, but that doesn't stop a whole bunch of people from thinking that at my university all the time and misinterpreting how these work. And there's national rules about this. You put in VAs that are affiliated with universities. You can put in a memorandum of understanding between the VA and the university affiliate that allows you 60 hours worked per week. So if you're a 5/8 employee, that makes 25 at the VA. That gives you 35 hours at the university. That means you're still a full-time employee of your university at 35 hours, so you get full-time benefits. No one thinks you're a part-time employee. It doesn't change your NIH grant effort very much. Inexplicably, my Office of Grants Administration at my university still likes to talk about percent effort instead of calendar months. I don't know why they do that. Rick said, my Grants Administration office, they act like I'm a real pain to them putting all these grants in. If I would just go away, they'd have a lot less work to do. They don't. It's even lower than the attitude, we don't care if you're funded or not. I mean, their attitude's below that. And so, it's not that they don't care. They wish I'd go away and stop putting grants in. So they persist in talking about percent effort when the NIH doesn't really care about percent effort. If you're a 35-hour employee, that means you have 10.5 calendar months to give to your grants, which is different than 12, but not so much different than 12. If you have so much NIH money that you've filled up your 10.5 calendar months, then, again, negotiating between the VA and the university, so you have, universities might not like this very much. You have an R01 at the university that has 20% effort or 2.4 calendar months. You could put all that effort at your VA. And now that means the university doesn't get any money to offset your salary. So sometimes chairmen and deans don't like that very much. But sometimes they're happy with that, especially if you've already got a bunch of salary offset. And so that's how you can work it, where you're a duly appointed faculty member at your VA and your university working a 60-hour work week. We're probably all working more than that anyway, and so it works out perfectly fine. The only thing you can't do about this, the only thing that gets you in trouble about this, if you're a clinician, what you better not be doing is being at the university side, billing patients at the same time you're being paid at the VA. So the VA inspector generals and the United States district attorneys will use words like theft by conversion when they talk about you, if you do that. And more colloquially, people will use the phrase double dipping when they talk about that. And that's all a federal crime. So you can't be billing patients at the same time the VA is paying you. And most VAs and universities now will ask you to fill out a time thing where you say, what 25 hours did I work for the VA? And actually, it's a little bit harder for non-collision PhDs, but physicians can say, I got up at 3 o'clock this morning and worked on my project, wrote a paper from 3 to 5 this morning, and you can put down 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. as part of the 25 hours you worked at the VA. And so they're a little harsher on non-clinician PhDs. They want you to work, 8 to 5. I'm not sure why that is, but that's the way it is now. And then I'll just remind you that the PI salary is not part of the VA budget. When you look at the VA grant budget, you may think that's not very big, although some of them are big now. So in the basic science area, basic science service, it's $165,000 a year. In the clinical research area now, it's up to $300,000 a year for 4 years, or $1.2 million for the whole 4 years. But that does not include the PI salary. So the PI salary comes from some other source. If you're a clinician, it comes from your clinical service, the medical service, the neurology service, whatever you're part of. And if you're a non-clinician PhD, it comes from your local research service. So that means that doesn't count as part of the grant budget. So that's highly useful. That means these VA grants are about the same size as an R01, where the typically the top budget is about $250,000 a year, although you can make them for more than that. Although that occasionally raises eyebrows too. I don't think review committees don't blink much about $300,000 a year and $3.25. But if you ask for $400,000 a year and it's not a multiple PI grant, I think the committees may give you a hard time about that. That's my personal experience working on the committees, I think. There's really nice career development awards at the VA. They're similar to K awards. And so therefore, junior faculty members, you have to be within 5 years of finishing your clinical training and 10 years of your terminal degree. And then non-clinician PhDs have to be within 10 years of their terminal degree for these awards. You need mentors for these awards. These are mentored awards, and you have to have a mentor who has a VA Merit Review Award. And so that person, these days in the 21st century, that person probably doesn't have to be next door to you. Your VA mentored person could be somewhere else in the world, as long as you can demonstrate how you're going to have good connection with that person. And most similar to K awards, these VA Career Development Awards need an educational plan. That's an important part of the consideration. If you're a clinician, maybe your education plan is to get a master's in clinical research from your institution, or an MPH. If you're a non-clinician PhD or a physician, maybe you're going to go to some coursework at Cold Spring Harbor for a couple of weeks and learn some new technique, or you're going to go to somebody else's lab for a few weeks and a month and learn some technique at someone else's lab. All that kind of thing could be an educational plan. Right now, what's really up at the VA is Career Development Awards 2. So there's a parent program announcement for that, and that really is there are some Career Development 1 awards up. This Career Development 2 award is probably not for people just perfectly fresh out of a postdoc or a fellowship, a clinical fellowship. You need some first author papers with your mentor. You published out of your fellowship or your postdoc, and then you probably need a couple of senior authored papers and looking like you're becoming a little bit independent from your mentor before you're ready to put in one of these CDA2. Although I think there are a number of awardees in the country who are more like the first one, who only have, maybe what you have a couple of first authored, 3 or 4 nice first author papers, but you have written a review with your mentor where you're the senior author. Something like that might make you competitive. There's a specific CDA2 for veterans. There's also a CDA2 for underrepresented minorities. And so it's not, when I read that underrepresented minority one, I can't quite figure out whether you need to have a mentor at a historically minority university or not. Sometimes when I read it, that's what it sounds like, but then there are people on duty who do not have that. When you read it, it really makes me think that's what you need. But then when I talk to people who are on duty across the country who have one of these awards, they don't necessarily have a mentor at a historically black or historically minority university. So I don't think you need that. To me, that's the way it reads when I read the request for proposals. But it is a very nice award. There are not that many people out there with it. Psychiatry and psychology have a CDA1 RFA, so a little bit more junior person, fresh out of your fellowship, fresh out of a postdoc, you're eligible. Fresh out of your PhD, you might be eligible for that. As I said, the review committee, the VA review committees very much mirror the NIH Center for Scientific Review. In my field, there are committees that are exactly parallel, the same makeup of those committees. A lot of my grants go to arthritis, connective tissue, and skin disease, and so at the VA it's called Immunology A, and it's made up about half dermatologists, half people interested in autoimmune rheumatic disease, and half of people are interested in immune and other dermatological diseases, and it's the same people back and forth going to both committees. The VA scoring is still 1 to 5. The VA has not changed off the old 1 to 5 system, so still 1 to 5, just like golf and just like the NIH. The lower score is better. And the criteria that we went through before, significance, investigators, innovation, approach, environment, that's all exactly the same as the VA. So it's highly similar. The VA has not added this language about premise, rigor, transparency, sex as a biological variant. So none of that is specifically required. I think almost all grants getting funded at the VA have that in there because people are writing grants they're writing the same, people are putting in the same grant. The VA committees, the VA submission rates, submission deadlines are only twice a year, but people are, so it's not exactly, they don't exactly parallel but they're close, and so there's a September 15th VA deadline and a March 15th VA deadline, so a lot of people are putting in the same grant on September 15th and then turning it around and putting it on October 5th at the NIH. So almost everyone has these things in there, and they're going to, you're going to have all this in there. I'd like a section in the Pacific Aims section, you restate the Pacific Aims. The next section I like is premise, hypothesis, and rationale. And I restate my premise. I restate a premise, or I state a premise and a hypothesis and a rationale for that aim right there. That only takes a few lines, 10 or 15 lines, but you have to have that in there. I think for every aim. The only other section that's required from the VA is a section about why this might be important to veterans. I think in most grants that is a paragraph or two, 20 or 30 lines. I study lupus. You might think, well, that's dumb. What has lupus got to do with veterans? But I can make a nice case that lupus has something to do with veterans. The United States Army is much more minority than the population, and so is lupus. And lupus is now one of the leading causes of being discharged from the United States Armed Services for women. Of course, trauma. Trauma on the battlefield, maybe not so much for women, but just having a car wreck. You have a car wreck and you become disabled and you're discharged. But medical discharge from medical illnesses, lupus and multiple sclerosis are sort of neck and neck in the VA for one of the most common reasons to get discharged. And that's a big deal to the VA and the United States Armed Services. And so I can make a nice case about lupus being important to the Veterans Administration. Anything that happens in older age, you can make a nice case for being important to the VA. The VA population, based on when people have been in the Army over the last few decades, is aging much more rapidly than the population. And younger veterans don't show up at the VA until they're older. And so the VA population is much older than the general population. So anything that happens at older age is potentially important at the VA. What is different about the VA? I think sometimes VA committees, maybe they don't explicitly say this, but they think this. Well, why doesn't this person just put this in at the NIH? And so I think sometimes they want to fund things. They're a little bit different from the NIH, that maybe you couldn't get funded at the NIH. And maybe it's a little bit VA-centric, some kind of VA-centric project that's about veterans, but it could still be, at my institution we have 5 preclinical studies about geriatrics. And so it's lifespan increase. One of them's about diet, cutting calories and increasing lifespan. 3 of them now are about sarcopenia. One person has this model where mice, I think it's mice, it's some kind of rodent, maybe it's rats, where they are lifted up with a little harness so they don't bear weight on their back legs, and they get sarcopenia because they're not using their back legs. So they're studying all preclinical stuff about how we all get old. And so this grant section about what's VA-centric, though, is very broadly viewed, as I said. You can make a case for just about anything. They like grants that engage clinicians, and so, I'm a clinician and a laboratory investigator, but if I want to say, I'm going to write a grant where I'm going to engage neurologists and psychologists to recruit PTSD for me, which I have a grant starting on April 1st about that, a VA grant about that. So I'm going to engage those guys to contribute to my research. VA committees really like that you're going to be able to engage clinicians who might not otherwise be able to be involved in research. They're not going to run a lab themselves. They're not statisticians. They don't have a Master of Public Health, but they can find patients eligible for my study. And I think VA grants VA grant committees really liked a combination of preclinical and clinical studies. So you can get a couple of aims that are preclinical, and then the third aim is in humans. So they like that sort of thing a lot. I'll just briefly mention, for anybody who's a non-clinician in the audience, how do non-clinicians get eligible? They said a clinician just has to be employed by the VA, or the director says, when you get this grant, we'll employ you. For rheumatology, that's easy because that's not much money. If you're an invasive cardiologist, that you may have to discuss that with your director a lot, but it doesn't bother him to hire another rheumatologist or endocrinologist very much. But there is a national committee, and so non-clinician PhDs have to put in a grant to a national committee that decides eligibility. And that application kind of looks like a letter of intent, sort of a 2 or 3 page description of your research, a regular old bio sketch, just like the NIH, and then it has to tell about how you've had VA service. Any station can put forward 2 people in all 4 of the areas. So per research service, basic, clinical, health related, and rehab. And they're really reviewed on 3 criteria. That's the project, and at this point, I think relevance to veterans is important. When you get to the big committee reviewing a grant, they're lining up the grants by score and by science, not really paying much attention to whether it's relevant to veterans. But this committee about non-clinician eligibility likes to talk about whether the project is relevant to veterans. And then you need some kind of VA service. As I said, that might be that your local associate chaplain of research just puts you on a VA committee. You're on the R&D committee. You're on the research safety committee. Or you might be national. And a really easy national one is you're on a grant review committee. VA, instead of serving at the NIH, you go up and ad hoc on the VA committees that are related to your area. But they do not presently view this non-clinician eligibility as an entry-level program. Really, non-clinician PhDs really need to already have national funding. You can't go to this eligibility committee and look like you've played out your string at the NIH and all your NIH grants have expired and your American Heart Grant and ADA grants are expired. You have to have national ongoing funding and look like you're going to be, now you want to turn to the VA. And so there is right now a national committee going, and my AO is on this committee, about how to change this process. I think how this process is likely to change is they do away with this national committee, and it'll be up to individual VA research stations. And everybody, instead of putting up 2 people in each division, the success rate is about 50%. They'll just say everybody can put up 1 person in each of these divisions, and that'll be easy. I'll just finish by saying there's really nice long-term positions at the VA that are called career scientists. There's a career scientist and a senior career scientist. So these are long-term retention programs for non-clinician PhDs, and now there's a new one started for clinicians, and they're 7 years long, and so that is really quite the award to get a 7-year award. And then there's also a long-term clinical investigator, a clinician position that's much like an R37, 8 years, where you get 8 years of funding instead of 4 years. As I said, there's I'll just remind you, if anybody's thinking about being a clinical trialist, you might think doing a clinical trial with a big budget and a complicated budget to a pharmaceutical industry might be a big disaster at the VA. And that is a common perception in our community, but across the country, I think, that the VA is going to be a bunch of rigmarole and trouble. This kind of pharmaceutical clinical trial at our VA and every VA across the country that's research intense does not go through the VA. It goes through a nonprofit corporation. Some of them are very big across the country, some of them are small. And these are authorized by federal law. There's about 80 of them, and they correspond perfectly to research intense VAs. That means clinical trial contracts and agreements go through the nonprofit, and so we will get, our nonprofit, if you get it to them by about 10 in the morning, they'll get a confidentiality agreement back to you that afternoon, approved by their lawyers. And then the total agreement, clinical trial agreement, might take a couple of days. At my institution, that might take a couple of months across the street at the university, and so it is not a hassle to do clinical research at this kind of pharmacological research at the VA. And just a list of the requests for proposals there. As you see, they, in many ways, they reflect these emphasis points that the VA has made across the country for these problems. There's also the Million Veteran Program. This is a national program begun in 2011. It has already enrolled 775,000 veterans, and every one of those people is going to have every kind of biological specimen that you can get out of blood stored, genes, DNA, RNA, plasma, sera, PAX genes, tubes, that sort of thing. So it's going to be about lifestyle and military exposure. You're going to be able to apply to this and get samples, and they're being collected. There you see the sites across the country. They're being collected all over the country. Some of those sites are closed. Some of those sites are still open, but they're aiming for 1 million total people enrolled. And so you'll be able to get all medical records, active duty medical records, active duty records about where they went, as well as samples from these people. And I might say there's one other resource that kind of that I've used a couple of times to success is the Armed Services Serum Repository Bank. And so this was a rheumatologist. I'm pleased to say it was a rheumatologist, a colonel in the Air Force, had this idea right as HIV serology became available. Everybody gets their blood drawn in a physical and induction, or when you accept a commission, and then you're supposed to have a physical every 2 years, or before you're deployed overseas. So he had the bright idea, right as HIV serology became available, that why don't we just save all that serum, for HIV, but also if you're deployed and there's biological warfare or there's some epidemic infection wherever you are, we can see where we can go back and look at sera before you're deployed. So they do that, and between the NIH campus and Walter Reed is the U.S. Armed Services Serum Repository. When I used it a few years ago, my colleagues and I used it. It had about 6 million samples on 50 million people. It now has 11 million samples on 60 million samples on 11 million people. And so yeah, it's quite the resource. It also brings me to the database research, which is very interesting at the VA. So in Austin, Texas, is the VA Information Resources Center. So that gets abbreviated VREC. And there I have it. I'm sorry, those are red. I meant to change those colors, change that off of red. But red and blue don't work very well together most of the time. But this is a national informatics center. So you can pose a question about numbers to them. Actually, used to have to pose the question to them. Now you can go to their website and say, okay, how many people in the VA are, how many 45-year-old to 65-year-olds are there at the VA that are taking HMG co-reductase inhibitors but still have an LDL cholesterol above 150, and they'll tell you the numbers. And then, of course, once you actually want data, you have to get IRB approval. But you can get numbers just by going on there. And the bottom website is actually more useful, but you have to be on a VA intranet. You have to be on a VA computer to get to that lower website. The top one you can go anyway. There are some disadvantages to being at the VA, and we already mentioned them briefly there. One is there's no indirect money, or there might be salary replacement money because now the VA is going to pay some of your salary, but there's no indirect money to your university. So provost, presidents, deans, chairmen may not care very much about your VA money because it doesn't give them any indirects. And you have to do a bunch of VA training. It's when you first onboard at the VA, you have to do one about the Constitution of the United States. It wasn't too bad, but there, you spend about maybe one day full-time equivalent doing VA training every year, but it's not too bad. One interesting advantage, though, that outweighs all those disadvantages is the funding rate, and I just put them up. There's the latest numbers I could find. So in the fall of 2018, remember there's a fall and a spring deadline at the VA. Merit reviews there, 421 submitted, 115 funded, so that's 27.3%. As you see, in the 2 cycles before that, above 28% once. The Career Development Awards, almost 50% funded in the last cycle, and in the 30s before that, so averaging in the high 30s over the last 3 cycles. And I think this funding rate of the VA is going to continue. VA research funding sort of flies under the radar. Maybe some of you noticed this surely won't be passed, but the President's budget calls for an 8% reduction of NIH spending. It doesn't call for any reduction of VA research spending, because nobody even knows the VA is doing research, as far as I know, and so no one knows to cut it, and we are just completely under the radar in terms of that sort of spending cut or that sort of thing, and so that 8% cut is not going to stand, almost surely. That won't happen. And another interesting smaller advantage is equipment. Your NIH grants and your university don't really recognize sometimes you need equipment. The first year of every VA grant, and that includes So every fourth year as you renew, the first year of renewal, you get $50,000 extra dollars on top of your budget to buy small equipment. So that needs to be, that's equipment up to 50,000. Each equipment item has to be more than 3,500. So you need a new PCR machine. You can buy it, whatever you might, under 50,000, whatever you might need. And then periodically, there's 2 in the last 18 months, our shared equipment evaluation program. So these are big awards. You can apply for up to $1 million worth of equipment. My VA station in the last 18 months, we put in 4 grants in one of these and 3 grants in the other one, and got roughly $2 million worth of equipment to our VA, common equipment that everybody can share. There's really nice bridge funding at the VA, $30,000 every 6 months after a grant runs out and you're trying to renew, which is hard to find these days. So the VA research is a viable and interesting alternative to NIH grant money, or it's a valuable addition to NIH money you already have, another way to increase your research. I'm happy to stop right there.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a quick question about MOU and rundown of the time. So let's say I have a grant from NIH, and then I heard that NIH may request that I should submit MOU to NIH. Then my question is, do you think NIH will believe that I'll be working 50 hours a week?
It's all approved nationally. They don't have any choice to believe it. That's who started it, was the NIH. So this is all started by the NIH and the VA at a national level. So this is all approved at the national level. Like I said, I think the only way you can get trouble is to bill patients when you're working for the VA if you're duly appointed. And so this happens all the time. We got clinicians. So in my institutions, clinical departments know how to do this perfectly, because medicine has 25 people that are duly appointed, none of whom are doing research necessarily. And neurology has 10 people. And so they do that all the time. My basic science departments for non-clinician PhDs, biochemistry doesn't know how to do this very well because there's only 2 people in biochemistry to do this in my institution. But clinical departments know how to do this all the time because they're clinicians duly appointed. So like my GI doctors, none of whom do laboratory-based work, but all of whom are publishing papers and doing these cooperative trials, they all work 4 days a week at the VA, 10 hours a day, and 1 day a week they go to the VA, they go to the university side and do clinic and scope and run a private clinic and all that sort of thing. And so they're all working something more than 40, and some of them 60 hours a week at the total. And so all that's it's all done nationally. It's all arranged already.
60 hours per week means 12 hours a day.
Yeah, we got the weekends, and then you've got, like I said, I don't know how everybody. It's one of the disadvantages of getting older. I can't sleep anymore, so I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I work, and I sit down at the typewriter. And sometimes I do Sudoku, sometimes I watch old movies, but sometimes I sit down at the typewriter and work on papers. And when I do that, I put that down as my VA time. So they'll let you put down 2 to 5 in the morning. So I don't think anybody has any trouble getting it in very much.
I had a question about the scenario that you touched on where you don't have VA aides, but you want to submit a grant. So how does a VA study section do that? So somebody sort of from the outside, so mid-career or even senior
Yeah.
career, says, oh, okay, I'm ready to jump into the VA pool. What study section was
The study sections I've been on don't seem to mind that. And you have a director's letter. Of course, you're right. It talks about your research, and you have to write a nice section for him or her saying how this person's going to is going to come on the staff and add expertise to our clinical enterprise also. And so I think I don't think they care very much, and I think sometimes they take the approach, well, this is a way to attract this interesting clinician to the VA. Now this person who's been at this university for all these years, a mid-career person maybe, is now going to come to the VA, do interesting research, and provide some clinical services, then that's a big benefit. I think the research service looks at does look at the national, administrative structure of the research services looks at this as a way to recruit clinicians to come to the VA.
And I want to second that, because having been on VA study section things, I think the study sections generally kind of assume that the issue of time
Is worked
has
out.
been sorted
Is all
out
worked out.
at the
Yeah.
local level.
I think that's right. I think that's
the
exactly what they
director's
think.
responsibility.
That's right.